الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وبعد. The topic that we have this afternoon has been entitled Muslims in America Connecting with the International Ummah. And I will begin. My name is Tamimi, and then I'll be followed by Brother Suhaib Webb. And then there's time for your comments and questions, inshallah. So, when we're talking about connecting with the international ummah, we're talking about basically our responsibilities and duties to the Muslims as a whole. We all understand that as Muslims, we constitute an ummah which is distinct from all other nations. As the Prophet ﷺ in the Constitution of Medina, when he came to Medina, they wrote the Constitution of Medina. It is mentioned therein that the Muslims represent an ummah in exclusion to all other peoples. And as the Prophet ﷺ has said in another hadith, Millatul Kufr Wahida, that the millah, or the nation of unbelief, is a single nation. So there are two ummahs. The ummah of faith and the ummah of unbelief. Unfortunately, what has happened, while this was a very clear concept in the minds of Muslims, let's just say 100 years ago or so, what happened is, due to colonialization, which was the conquest of the unbelievers of the lands of the Muslims began to distance themselves from this reality. And instead of allegiance to Islam and to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, allegiance became toward other banners. At times the allegiance was to one's nation, a nationalistic allegiance. At times it became allegiance to a political party or other manifestations of this. So the notion of a single ummah was lost. And people began to identify themselves and began to show allegiance upon other banners. These banners are the banners of Jahiliyyah, ignorance, which the Prophet ﷺ has said in a hadith, دَعُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا, leave it alone, for it is something which is repugnant. And indeed the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever calls for a call of Jahiliyyah, he is calling to the hellfire. They said, even if he fasts or prays, even if he fasts or prays and claims he's a Muslim. So a Muslim's allegiance should be to Islam and Islam alone. That's the only allegiance we have. And we look at the world through those lenses. We look at the world through the lens as how close a person is to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The closer a person is to the teachings of the Prophet, the closer our allegiance is to him, and the greater our allegiance to him. The further a person has distanced himself from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teachings, the further we distance ourselves from that person. And that is the principle by which we should conduct ourselves. Indeed, us Muslims, we constitute an ummah which is not just an ummah that is unique to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his followers, but we are part of a greater ummah which extends to all the prophets and their true followers. We are an ummah which goes to the Prophet Adam alayhi salam, and throughout history all the prophets throughout this history and their true followers, coming to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions and the true followers of the Prophet and his companions ﷺ, until we have the last Muslims on the face of the earth, those who will come when the Messiah and Masih ibn Maryam, Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam, returns to earth and descends, and the generations that come thereafter. This is all a single ummah, an ummah of faith. Indeed, our ummah is such that it not only extends to human beings, but it also extends to other creatures which share the same faith and belief as us, like the angels, like those believing jinns. They are also part, we are all part of this one ummah in the sense that we all worship Allah Azza wa Jalla alone. And so therefore, you find that Islam teaches us that we have certain etiquette that we need to observe before the angels, before the other creatures, because this is part of the general bonds we have of faith. But what our focus is this afternoon, what we would like to discuss this afternoon, is our connections with the ummah as a whole. Unfortunately, there are those people who are trying to sever Muslims in the United States from the ummah as a whole by trying to implant an idea amongst Muslims in the United States. Some do it out of a malintent, others do it ignorantly, that we Muslims in the United States are somewhat distinct from the Muslims in the world. In other words, we have our own problems. And they try to argue that we're first and foremost Americans, and those are those people. So, yeah, we're all Muslims, but we are Americans. We should be concerned with what is important for America, and what those people face and suffer. That's what their problems are. And this obviously contradicts the notion of our faith, and contradicts the notion of our religion. Okay. Now, what I'd like to talk about, though, is I would like to talk about 9 principles that I have before me on how we can, on the incumbency of Muslims uniting and cooperating. Because I think, and I would hope that amongst the brothers who have attended this lecture, the idea that we constitute a single ummah is clear, should be clear in our minds. Okay? If there's anybody who has doubts concerning that matter or has questions, we can then address that during the question and answer session. But I would think that the majority of us, we understand this single, the notion of a single ummah, and so therefore, we need to, based upon that, we need to talk about the more practical matters, about the incumbency of Muslim cooperation now. But there is one thing I'd like to mention, which would show us the importance of Muslim unity, and this is the following hadith. Many of us, I think, or all of us, are familiar with the life of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Among the events that occurred in his life was that when he, as a young man, broke the idols, in his land, okay, the pagans of his land commanded to build a fire and to burn Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a miracle to show that he was a prophet sent by Allah Azza wa Jal and upon the truth, commanded the fire, right, to not burn Ibrahim alayhi salam or harm him. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Kuni, the fire, be cool and salaman, not harmful to Ibrahim alayhi salam. So Allah commanded the fire with the nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created fire that has the property of burning, right? And that when a human being is placed in a fire, it consumes the human being and it causes harm to that human being and pain to that human being. And that's why among the punishments in the hereafter is that there's a fire in which human beings and jinn are burnt. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to show as a sign, as a miracle, just like other prophets have other miracles, that the fire would, when Ibrahim was cast into it, right, it neither burnt him or harmed him. Now, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam informs us that when this fire was being kindled and Ibrahim was inside it, all the creatures attempted to blow the fire out. I mean, the creatures on the earth, that were there, right, the animals and so forth, right, they attempted to blow out the fire, to extinguish it, to douse out its flames. Why? Because they share with Ibrahim that faith. They are also worshipping Allah Azza wa Jalla in their own way, as animals and birds and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ told us, except for the wazagh. The wazagh might be translated into English as a chameleon or something like that. It's a type of lizard, okay? It did not seek to douse out the flames, but rather what it did was it attempted to kindle the flames. So what did the Prophet ﷺ command us to do? The Prophet ﷺ commanded us that whenever we come across this wazagh, this type of lizard, right, to pelt it with stones and to kill it. What does it show us? It shows us the connection of a single ummah. You see that back to the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, how the Prophet ﷺ commanded us, right, to take this position towards this creature, because this creature took a position of animosity toward the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. That is to illustrate the nation of an ummah, okay? So if that is toward an animal, then how much more so toward human beings?